or for all gentlemen to pick up or will it work okay on the?
Hello? Hello?
Okay, he can hear you? That's good.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Actually, I'll set it off first.
Mic check.
Hit say test.
Test.
Can you hear you? So you can turn yours off. Audio test. Say,
Okay.
test.
Testing.
Well, he can hear you.
Okay.
So thank you. I appreciate it.
Good afternoon. Hello and welcome. My name is Catherine Russell Brown, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Race Relations, and also a faculty member here at the Levin College of Law. Hello to every one of you in the Chesterfield Smith Ceremonial Classroom, and to the audience in the overflow classrooms, and to those who are listening and watching online. The mission of the Race Center is to foster communities of dialogue on race through curriculum, through teaching, scholarship, and programming, with a focus on grounding this work in history and empirical reality. Today's program is a perfect fit with these aims. With the 60th anniversary of desegregation on the horizon, the Race Center decided to engage in a project, a desegregation project, that not only marked the milestone, but provided a historical backdrop of the legal and social efforts behind desegregation across the country. Today's program is one part. Later in the program, the Race Center's postdoc, Dr. Deidre Houchin, will share with you another piece, an incredible 3-site exhibition on Black educators in Florida that are a critical piece and part of UF's desegregation story. Another part of the project is the brochure that was included with your program, which highlights the law school faculty's wide-ranging scholarship and expertise on race. We have a full, enriching, sobering, uplifting, enlightening program planned for this afternoon. All of this was done with the help of the law school's dean's office, with media, events, tech, and staff support, and also with our campus partners, including the Office of the Chief Diversity Officer, African American Studies Program, the Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research, the Sam Proctor Oral History Program, the Multicultural Council and Diversity Affairs, almost done, Association of Black Faculty and Staff, the Association of Black Alumni, the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere, and the Bob Graham Center, who are also live streaming this event. Now I'd like to welcome from the UF Law Dean, Laura Rosenbury.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you all for being here today. I see many alumni in the room, and I welcome you back to the law school, and particularly Judge Mickle in the front row, Harley Herman, who will be speaking with us in a few minutes, Lori Gleim, and 2 members of the Law Center Association Executive Board, James Cunningham and Scott Hawkins. Thank you so much for being here today. And it's also wonderful to see so many visitors from outside of the law school. So if you are visiting UF Law for the first time, I sincerely hope it will not be the last. You are always welcome to join our intellectual community, and we're so happy you're here today. And I particularly thank the members of the Starke and Hawkins families for being here today. Your families and so many other families in the state of Florida endured a terrible injustice when the state refused to admit so many promising students to this institution solely because of their race. We will never be able to erase that injustice. It lives with us. But we must, as an institution, take responsibility for those harms and be vigilant in fighting the inequalities that persist to this day. We remember the bravery, the tenacity, the persistence of Virgil Hawkins and George Starke, and we aspire to continue their work. Every day we are here at UF Law. Before we start the formal program today, I must extend a sincere thanks to Professors Ken Nunn and Sharon Rush, who co-founded the Center for Race and Race Relations. We would not be here but for your efforts several decades ago. I also thank Professor Catherine Russell Brown, the director of the center, as well as Dr. Deidre Houchin, who is the center's postdoctoral associate. for their tireless work in putting together today's event. And now, to begin the official program, it is my honor and privilege to introduce Harley Herman, who is a member of the UF Law Class of 1977 and president of the Virgil Hawkins Historical Society, as well as a practicing attorney with Herman and Herman, PA. Harley, please join us at the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. It's particularly a very good pleasure to have Judge Mickle here because he was one of my supervising attorneys when I was a third-year intern in the program that now bears Virgil Hawkins' name. And I've always been indebted to him for the lessons he taught me as a young novice. Let me begin to describe Virgil Hawkins' contribution by stating that I never fully appreciated the education I received here until I met the man who was denied that education. A man who began practicing the same year I did. He was a poor 70-year-old African American opening a solo practice more than a decade after he graduated from an unaccredited law school. I was a third-year, 25-year-old University of Florida law student appearing in court with the help and assistance of my supervising attorneys. And while we celebrate today what Mr. Hawkins accomplished for others, story that I'm about to tell you is a tragedy that could have and should have been avoided. And it's my hope that the story demonstrates to you what Mr. Hawkins, Mr. Starke, and the university's first African American students made easy for those of us who entered UF decades later. Came as a great price to these Gator pioneers. And this is why I continue to back the drive begun by students in 2012 for Florida to erect the same type of integration monument that FSU, Mississippi, and other southern universities have memorialized on their campuses. And I hope that we hear soon that that monument has finally been approved. I have passed out here some of the law review articles, including mine, that describe the legal issues in detail because the time that each of us allotted is relatively brief. And so today I really want to concentrate on the human aspect of how we failed Mr. Hawkins as a consumer of legal services. All that Mr. Hawkins asked the university and our courts to do was what we've all enjoyed without a court battle, the right to attend a law school paid for by his tax dollars. He wasn't the most qualified of the original 5 plaintiffs, and when he applied, you could attend this college of law without an undergraduate degree, and since he had run out of money when he attended college, he didn't have that degree until 3 years after he sued for admission. When he joined the other plaintiffs, he simply hoped to ride on their coattails to enter this university. And if Florida had obeyed the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Sweat versus Painter, it would have admitted Hawkins and the other 4 applicants. Instead, Florida defied Sweat in its decision to open the same type of school at FAMU that Sweat held was not equal and thus constitutionally improper. Those of you who are students, remember what you went through to apply to get into this law school? Well, imagine if instead of having to go through that, you just received a telegram like that in the mail saying, congratulations, an application you never filed had been accepted. And here's the date, place, and time to show up and enroll in your classes so you can start law school. I know that if Hawkins had his preference, he would have accepted that offer. The problem is that if he did that, the lawsuit would have ended. because in that time, he was now the sole plaintiff. And that happened, I think, primarily because Christmas of 1951, NAACP leader Harry T. Moore and his wife went to sleep with the hope of enjoying Christmas with their daughter the next day. The bomb that blew up under their bed was of such intensity that the bed rails landed in the ceiling. And Mr. Moore died on the way to the hospital in the back of a car because separate but unequal provisions didn't include an ambulance service for black people in need of medical care. Soon after that, all the other applicants dropped out. And so much of when I look at this history, I try to go back into what I wish would have happened. And I wish at that point that his lawyers had said to him, you served your time. You don't need to be the sole soldier trying to hold the hill. Go on to FAMU. You'll be of much greater value to us as one of our attorneys than as a litigant in our action. But that isn't what happened. And in 1954, as a companion to the Brown case, the Supreme Court ordered that Hawkins was entitled to admission as a qualified applicant. Rather than obey that, the Board of Control, which governed this university, and the Florida Supreme Court chose to disobey the United States Supreme Court. And because the court said as a qualified applicant he was eligible for admission, they began a campaign to prove him morally and scholastically unqualified. And so in a compromise with his attorneys, they reached an agreement where he would not be awarded relief, but the university would be enjoined from preventing other students from attending. If you know anything about class actions, you know that the absolute rule is if the named plaintiff isn't entitled to relief, you can't award it to the class. But at this point in time, our courts were not obeying anything that was a matter of law. So the 1958 order, which opened this school and ultimately led to all the universities and all the programs being desegregated, was illegally entered but complied with. Only Mr. Hawkins wasn't one of the beneficiaries. I kind of wish his story had ended then through a series of events in the 1970s, which I describe in my article, which you can see in the YouTube video that I've got listed on that sheet. There was an opportunity for him to be admitted to the Florida bar. The court knew at the time that the remedy wouldn't work, but when they listed why it wasn't possible, the first black justice of the Florida Supreme Court had a blistering dissent that basically said that some of the justices, including ones that were still on the court, had done something that was not only illegal but merited their disbarment and removal from the court. And as a compromise, once again, Hawkins became the sacrificial lamb. They admitted him to practice, but they knew the practice would fail. I wish when they had done the order that they had left in part of Justice English's initial draft where he said, we're left in the difficult position of having before us an injustice of our own making, having the exclusive power to rectify it, and having a competing public concern which militates against individual relief. Because that should have been a reminder as we as a state watched his life and his practice unravel. But that wasn't part of it, and the end of his life was as I knew it. The last time that I saw him, about 9 months before the fatal stroke that ended his life, what I can tell you is obviously I knew what had happened, wounded him, but he wasn't a broken man, and I couldn't at the time quite figure out why. But as I attended his funeral, met African American lawyers who benefited from his struggle, and as I came to this university to deal with trying to get the clinic named for him, I did understand what was there. Many of you are not old enough to have been alive during his lifetime, but he knew one day you would be here. And for him, the future was more important than anything that happened to him in the past. And so my thought to you in terms of honoring this man's legacy is to take a little bit of what he sought to do down the road a few extra miles. If you're still a student, when you get into third year, enroll in his clinic. If you help one individual in his name, you will be doing honor to everything that he wanted to do during his lifetime. And I know if you do that, that in that place in heaven where Mr. Hawkins and Thurgood Marshall argue about cases on a Sunday afternoon, that they'll look down upon you and smile. And thank you again for attending today.
Good afternoon. My name is Courtney Handy, and I'm a second-year student here at the Levin College of Law. I have the honor of serving as the president of the W. George Allen chapter of the Black Law Students Association. The Black Law Students Association is an organization here to provide a voice for black students and to advocate for issues that we may face as black students on this campus. We try to encourage community engagement, professional development, and to ensure that our members are prepared to go out into the legal profession and represent Levin well. I'm also a member of the Florida trial team and a teaching assistant here on campus. Originally from Miami, Florida, I had no intention growing up to attend school in Gainesville. Big city to small city wasn't very appealing to me. And when I came to visit the school, it wasn't necessarily the faces that I saw up on the walls that encouraged me to attend this institution either. It was more so the history of the individuals such as Mr. Starke and Mr. Hawkins who had fought for our place as black students at this institution. That's what I found most encouraging, most inspiring. And I think as black students on this campus, oftentimes we may feel that we don't belong or that this is not a place. It's just a struggle that we sometimes have in sense of belongingness. But when we think about this history and the sacrifices and the persistence of you all and your family, I think it's motivation for us to continue to do the great work and continue your legacy of advocacy and justice. So during my legal education, I'm especially proud to continue this legacy of justice and advocacy. And the Black Law Students Association in particular is working on a new project called Participatory Defense. Now, this is a community effort where we want to go out into the community working with local organizations to just knock on doors and to ask members of the community how familiar they are with their legal rights. If an arrest were to happen, what are the expectations they have of officers? If it were to go beyond that, what are their expectations of attorneys? And during our Founders Week, we actually went out and simply knocked on doors and asked these questions. And I think one of the most rewarding parts of this experience for us as black students was the way people responded to us. To see young black faces who were law students, people were extremely happy to see that we were out in the community and that we wanted to hear what they had to say. And so in closing, on behalf of myself and on behalf of the Black Law Students Association, we just want to say thank you. Thank you, Mr. Starke, for your persistence. Thank you for your sacrifices. And we will hope to continue to make you proud here at the University of Florida Levin College of Law.
Over the 60-year period between 1910 and 1970, 6 million blacks left the South. African Americans migrated from the Deep South to up north and to out west. Most left determined to find a less harsh life, one with better paying jobs, educational opportunities, less Jim Crow segregation, state oppression, and Klan violence. Many blacks, however, remained in the South. They too resisted the everyday injustices they faced. They agitated. They pushed back. In these times, their desire was simple: to be at home in the world. They wanted freedom, which meant full access to employment where they were qualified to work, to live where they could afford the rent or mortgage, to shop at stores and try on clothes, to enter through the front door of hotels, restaurants, and buses, to pursue careers of their own choosing, and to gain admission to any tax-supported public institution of education. It was the desire to be free that inspired Mr. Starke to apply to the University of Florida. He'd read in the papers that Florida schools, including UF, were finally going to be forced to admit black students. Mr. Starke's decision to apply, which caused his mother great worry and concern, came during turbulent and scary times in this nation. The 1950s were not an easy time to be black and alive in the U.S. In the 1950s, lynchings were a bone-chilling fact of life. There were so many mob executions in one Florida county that a state investigator commented, "A Negro accused of crime never lived long enough to go to trial." In addition to lynchings, executions of blacks were commonplace. In the 1950s alone, 334 blacks on death row were executed. In 1951, as Harley Herman mentioned, Harry Moore and his wife Harriet Moore, both educators and NAACP leaders, were killed on Christmas Day when their home was bombed. Okay? Not long after that, in 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi. In the midst of racial terror, there were signs of progress. The 54 Brown decision, the 1955 year-long Montgomery bus boycott, okay, and in the late 50s, universities and school districts around the country were being forced to desegregate. By the time Mr. Starke applied to law school, the civil rights movement was well underway. It took courage and faith in the unseen for him to apply to a university that had never before admitted a black student and had actively fought against allowing them entry.
I am delighted to take part in the introduction of our honored guest, George H. Starke, Jr. George Starke blazed a trail that our students still follow today. He broke barriers, not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of people he would never meet. Because of the disgraceful behavior of leaders at this institution, of leaders in this community, and the behavior even of our own students, George Starke was never able to attain his dream of becoming a lawyer. What did Mr. Starke do instead? Well, he built an extraordinarily successful business career. And this is important. He gave back to this institution, this university, that had so fundamentally disrespected him. Even more importantly, George Starke laid the foundation for the generations of black law students who followed him and continue to follow him at this law school. Now, one thing I have learned during my 3.5 years here at UF Law is that our alumni, the lawyers who have walked these halls, know the sacrifice Mr. Starke made. The sacrifice he made so that we could all have access to this incredible legal education. When Mr. Starke joined UF Law, Brown had been decided just 4 years before, and it would take another 4 or 5 years for flagship universities in Mississippi and Alabama to desegregate. Fred Levin, for whom the Levin College of Law is named, was a classmate of Mr. Starke. Fred recently wrote a letter to our president, President Fox, honoring his classmate. And I would like to read an excerpt from that letter by Fred Levin. I quote, "Thinking back to September 1958, I, along with 360 other freshmen, entered the University of Florida College of Law. We were in the law school auditorium at the intersection of University and 13th, our old building, when the back door of the auditorium opened. As I looked around, everyone, except one white woman, were white males. Coming in the back door was an African American dressed in a suit. This gentleman, George Starke Jr., began what had to be a miserable 3 semesters for him. Neither the dean nor any of the professors wanted George to succeed. And they did everything they could to prevent his success from happening. It's amazing that George was able to last even 3 semesters. George Starke Jr. successfully integrated a public institution within the state of Florida years before the University of Mississippi and University of Alabama. During his time at the law school, it appeared that all of the other freshmen had groups who would study together. That is, all except George and myself. Of course, the reason George was not included was that he was African American. And the reason I was not included is that I probably had the lowest undergraduate GPA of any of the 360 students. What was interesting is that after the first semester, I was leading the class in GPA, and George and I became study partners. Thereafter, George became accepted by the great majority of his classmates, but unfortunately to no avail. George Starke Jr., in this day and time, would have clearly been a graduate of our law school. Unfortunately, it was a different time. Mr. Levin unfortunately could not be here today because of health reasons, and for that he sends his deepest regrets. But I thank him for being present in spirit with his words of support. We owe Mr. Starke, Mr. Hawkins, and their families a deep debt, one that we can never repay. As a law school, we pledge to remember their sacrifices, and we resolve to push our society in a more just direction. The best way to do so, I think, is to recruit the best and most diverse law students from all walks of life. Yes, thank you. And then to train them, to learn from the experiences of the past, and to become leaders of tomorrow. As a college, we remain committed to upholding the foundational promise of our great national experiment, that we are a people ruled neither by strength nor standing, but by law. That is my promise, so long as I am dean. I'm now pleased to ask Angela Starke, Mr. Starke's daughter-in-law, to come to the podium to continue this introduction of our honored guest. Thank you so much.
In 1986, I met a guy who knocked me off my feet. I was at an Atlanta hotel, and he was waiting for his car. We were introduced. His name was Drew. And I went back, ladies, the next day to the same spot to see if he was there, so hint, hint. He was, but this time he was with his father. And that man is George H. Starke, Jr. I am so honored and somewhat more emotional than I thought, to introduce George. But first, I'd like to thank Dean Rosenbury. I'd like to thank Director Russell Brown and the Center for the Study of Race and Race Relations, distinguished faculty, students, alumni, and guests. If you could travel back with me to 1986 to that Atlanta hotel, within the first 30 seconds of meeting George, I was in. We clicked. And the reason we clicked was because I was from Florida, he was from Florida. And that's all that mattered. George loves Florida. And we always joke that anytime you're hearing one of those crazy news stories and it's getting more weird, and you're going, please don't be from Florida, please don't be from Florida. George is unfazed. He's like, I don't care, it's the greatest state. He loves Florida. I had yet to meet my future mother-in-law, and thank God she turned out to be a gem too. But if my first indication with George was if my first conversation was any indication, this was going to be a great family. And I did marry his son, Drew, and George and I have been having conversations about Florida and all its ugliness and glory for the past 30 plus years. We've had conversations about politics. George is a politico. We've had long discussions about presidents, political parties, pundits, and the press. I did talk to him last night, and not to mention we've talked about scandals. We've had conversations about music. He listens to Zydeco and blues, but he will attend the symphony, and he will enjoy a Broadway show. We've had conversations about whether the medicinal properties of red wine are as salubrious as some say, and because George is 87, I'll have what he's having, which is red wine. I discovered early on that George is a native of Orlando. He's the son, born to the union, of one of the area's first black physicians and a school librarian. He went to Palmer Memorial Institute in North Carolina for high school, and I would encourage any of the students here, if you don't know Palmer Memorial and that history, that's a very good history story as well. He's a graduate of Morehouse College, and he served in the U.S. Air Force. And we have had conversations about all of those things. Surprisingly, the conversations we weren't having were about the University of Florida and his time here as the first black student admitted specifically to the law school. Whenever I asked George about it, he gave me some epigrammatic response such as, there's really not much to it, Angela. It was a long time ago. To tell you the truth, I don't think about it much. And it was pretty much a one-way conversation. Out of all the conversations George and I could have, he would not talk about that. So I set off, being the journalist that I was. I went to the library, and back in those days, this was before Google, so I went to an actual library, pulled some microfiche, and I was amazed at the articles and the photos that I saw of George in an auditorium by himself, surrounded by a dozen or so photographers. They were all capturing that one moment of desegregation here at the University of Florida. Around the same time that I began my brief research in the early 90s, UF reached out to him, and I'm hoping he'll give us the circumstances behind that. It was an olive branch and one that George warmly welcomed. And then we began to have our first conversations about the University of Florida. He told me he felt isolated but was never threatened, at least not in person. Before leaving early, he felt, for the most part, that he had been accepted by his classmates. There was a mention of state troopers or the National Guard following him, shadowing him without his knowledge so that they could protect him from any harm. And then there was that time that he was warned not to go home to Orlando by way of the Ocala National Forest because of Klan activity. I was getting bits and pieces, and we were finally having that conversation. George, who has a generous and forgiving spirit, a man who is very humble, very approachable, has a great sense of humor, loves a good joke. He had finally become comfortable talking about his time here. So George, thank you for finally having that conversation. It is still a conversation that is needed, and I know you have much to share, and I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation today. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce George H. Starke, Jr.
say after that kind of an introduction. And in fact, like all of the introductions and everything that's been said already, except thank you. To Dean Rosenbury, Professor Catherine Russell Brown, Dr. Deidre Houchin, Judge Stefan Michael and his wife, Ms. LaKay Banks, and everybody. Attorney Herman, thank you for the very interesting information that you always provide about Mr. Hawkins. I never met Mr. Hawkins, but he did call me the Thanksgiving of my first year here to find out how I was getting along and to wish me well. That had been our only conversation. Angela, I thank you too. And for everybody who has anything to do with the program, likewise. I want to thank the audience, the family and friends of Mr. Hawkins, my family and friends for attending today's event, and I want to be sure I haven't missed anybody. So 60 years, and you have to ask, where did the time go? It seems more like yesterday than yesteryear. In some ways, it seems that the more things change, the more they remain the same, only they may be expressed differently. Today, less subtly and more openly. There's no standing in the school bus, in the school doors like there used to be. No more National Guards, guardsmen and women to assure safe passageways into schools. Only a few isolated cases of cross burnings anywhere in the whole country, although there are, in some areas, they still occur. No more shootings of people over their rights to attend school. They shot for something else, or for nothing. But as in Mississippi, where that really did happen, to James Meredith, who was shot in a protest march. And I think he did survive. Last I heard, which was a long time ago, at that point he was working for Senator Strom Thurmond. I don't believe he ever passed the bar. But nothing like this occurred at the University of Florida. It was kind of like a quiet in the midst of a storm. I mean, all these things that everybody has mentioned did go on, and they were going on, but the campus here at that time was more like a kind of an oasis. You didn't feel the pressures that of that kind that other students who had done first at their colleges and universities felt. And I think the reason for that was because of the attitude of Governor Collins at the time, and Dr. Wrights as well, who had, of course, okay. Is that better? Is that better? Okay. If it's not, just raise your hand. So I think that Governor Collins and Dr. Wrights, when the time came, they had been, of course, the incidents of people ignoring the Supreme Court, doing the things that you just mentioned, But when they decided to honor those decisions and to implement them, one day I got a visit from Jim Glass, who at the time was president of the law school student body. He lives in Miami. And he came over to see me, and he told me that nobody knew what to expect. Nobody knew what was going to happen when I got here. And he said that the school just wants to be sure that you're safe. And I told him all I want to do is be treated like everybody else. And he said he thought that would happen. So he told me, though, that on September 15th, when school starts, I should already have my books and things, and I should come over the Sunday before, because as they did for Oprah Winfrey, they were going to open the bookstore just for me. So I went in and picked up my books. They already knew what my assignments were going to be, so I had my course material a day early, some of it, but books, yes. So had Governor Collins and Dr. Wrights, the other point I was going to make, no doubt did enforce the rules, and he probably was opposed to Mr. Hawkins, just to be fair. But after my tenure here, what I saw was the effect of the personality of those two figures, and it's clear how the personality of a leader permeates the system over which they lead. And that was a feeling that I had my first day here. And the dean just read a letter from Fred, who needs no introduction somehow. And he and David Levy, who at the time was editor of the Alligator, David had been the first person to come and sit by me after a break in the auditorium. And what happened is that I was sitting there alone, but one of my cousins dropped me off at 13th and U. And I walked, I saw all the reporters out front of the building. And I decided I don't really want to walk through that crowd. And fortunately, Fred said the back door, but it really was a side door. So that's the door that it was open, so I just walked in. And I told myself as I was walking in, don't sit at the back of the auditorium. And so I sat down front in the center. And of course, nobody was anywhere near me. But after a bit, it began to soften. And David came over. And then after another break, I had gone outside, or actually I think the reporters came in during that break. They wanted to know all about me, like, what's your name? Where are you from? Are you a member of the NAACP? I wasn't, but I said, and I hope this wouldn't be used against me later for not telling the truth at that moment, because I had been a student member, but at that point the answer was no, except I didn't tell them no. I said, yes, I am a student member. So they said, well, are they paying your way to school here? I said, no. And they said, well, what school did you go to? And I told them Morehouse College in Atlanta. And then the next day I saw in the paper that they had written it up and said, that's the same school that gave us Martin Luther King. So I don't know what they expected. But it was in the papers. So I have my notes, but I'm not following them very well. So what happened is that somebody mentioned the fact that the Highway Patrol had escorted me without knowing that they were escorting me, because there were two people in one of the long lines that we had to go through in those days before computers. And you know, I was wondering, why are these guys so old? they just stood out. And one was in front of me and one was behind. You know, but not real close, which was all right because they had better vision that way. And what happened is that I never, we went to class and I noticed, you know, the first day or two I saw them. I wondered, why come they're not coming into class? They were just hanging out in the hall. And so it looked suspicious, but they didn't do anything. They just looked around all day. And in the evenings, you go to the library, and Fred and I, by then, were always the last to leave. And they would be out on what was the patio at the time, smoking. And we would pass by and they said, good night. And I was living with relatives, and across the street I noticed that there was a county sheriff's car parked every night when I got home. And I wondered why they were doing that, but there was an automobile dealership there near Chestnut Funeral Home, and the car was always hidden among the other cars so that a miscreant might not see it. And so, but anyway, he had a good view of the house. That before this first semester, we had a notice that I should not go home through the forest, as Angela just mentioned, because the word was that I may be mistaken for a deer through the park, because the Klan had been very busy. And what happened is that the Highway Patrol had also infiltrated the Klan, so that's how they knew. And during that time, I was told later that I got some nasty letters, but nobody ever showed them to me when I was in school. I think the one that had real bad handwriting was the ones that they were concerned about. So I never saw but one or two. So if I had some friends or somebody who didn't write well, I never heard from them. My father was mentioned a couple of times. My mother didn't want me to come here because she was afraid. And I never had that feeling. He was enthused and had always wanted to come here himself. And during the time he was in school, Florida was a part of a pact of southern states which had a program where they would be glad to pay the transportation of any medical student to go to either Howard or to Meharry, and pay some of their tuition and some of their expenses, and that's what they did. But later, after I had matriculated here, he became the first black physician to have hospital privileges in Sanford, first black president of the Seminole County Medical Association, and one or two other things. But he also came over here frequently to attend, not classes, but seminars and participate in various programs and the like. So, okay, I guess basically, I always say that I only had 2 bad days here. And the first one, or one of them in any event, was I was 5 minutes late to a class, to an exam rather. And when I got there, the door was locked, which was a very uncomfortable feeling because the professor was looking somewhere else and never did come to the door. So that was one problem. And the other problem was even more strange because it was a class in criminal law. And I knew everything there was to know about criminal law from Mr. Clark. And when I sat down, I knew everything. And when I left, there was nothing on my paper because my mind had just gone totally blank. And it probably had my name on it, but it shouldn't have because by then they were using numbers. And I think that is about the most of the highlights that I have in mind. And I want to thank you all very much for your interest, and I appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Akil Reynolds. I am currently the Black Student Union president here at the University of Florida. I am a fourth-year public health major with a minor in health disparities in society. So I have this issue where wherever I write speeches, I don't tend to stick to them because I'm very easily impacted, as I was by your speech, Mr. George Starke. But before I get started, I just want to thank you, Dr. Deidre Houchin, sorry, Dr. Deidre Houchin. Thank you to the Levin College of Law and the Center for Race Relations. I want to start off with my experience as a black student here at the University of Florida, or even before then. I will never forget the day when I got accepted into the University of Florida. It was an amazing accomplishment for me to become a part of this university community, and it was difficult for me to imagine that I would be accepted into such a prestigious university. I am glad that Mr. Starke and Mr. Hawkins paved the way to make that possible. Throughout my time here at UF, I have become very aware of how often injustice occurs in our society. In my role as a student leader, I have listened intently as students share their story with me, but the resources offered by this institution have helped me and others discover ways to focus our energy into helping others. Especially black students excel academically and socially, and I thank early black student advocates such as Mr. George Starke, who endured what was likely and what I definitely have learned was a taxing and difficult environment to ensure that this university develops into a diverse, inclusive, and equitable place to learn where our cultural and gender and racial identities are able to thrive. It is beautiful for me to think about how we have thrived even in hard times and we find ways to overcome. We owe it to our early alumni and former students who have given up so much to ensure that black students and all students can imagine themselves being admitted and accepted at the University of Florida. It is my duty and each of our duty to ensure that we honor this legacy and celebrate our presence at this institution even when it can become difficult and there's definitely more work to be done. But if you cherish something, like I cherish my opportunity here at UF, you work hard. That's what I learned from elders such as Mr. George Starke and Mr. Virgil Hawkins, and I'm grateful to follow in the paths that they have created. And I just want to end by saying, even after listening, being at this program today, just thinking about how this year is also the 50th year of the existence of the Black Student Union at the University of Florida, and thinking about how that is something that would have never even existed, and thinking about how it's grown to be one of the largest student organizations here at this institution, all because of the work of early Black student pioneers. And I can't thank you all enough for everything that you have done and all that you have endured to create opportunities and true social mobility, and how this will translate into the Black community outside of the UF Falls. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Amata, and I serve as Students Taking Action Against Racism Agency's Chair for Student Government. I'm a third-year student majoring in criminology with a minor in business. As a first-generation Mexican-American, I am honored to be part of this event, especially in the presence of Mr. George Starke, whose impact has allowed me, a daughter of immigrants, to attend one of the best universities in Florida. Early this semester at the Student Government Retreat, our Vice President took us a walk along the Rice Union Hall of Fame on the 3rd floor. He asked us to look around and see if we noticed anything special. And I did. Through the years, our students have grown more diverse. While a good portion of these students were white males, the other portion grew more diverse. In the last several decades, these pictures have changed. Our student leaders on the Hall of Fame slowly morphed from solely white males to include more females and students of color from all races, ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds. This change would have never been possible if it wasn't for Mr. George Starke, who saw the injustices and fought for equality. It was their fight that allows me to stand before you today. My parents come from a small village in Mexico, where higher education was only a dream. Attending the University of Florida is a dream, and I'm happy to be living in it. The fight for justice is not over yet. There are still things we need to change on this campus. As most of us are aware, this year, our number of Black students has decreased. We need to ensure that all students, despite their background, feel welcomed and represented on our campus. Through STAR, I want to encourage all students to combat racism by stepping outside their comfort zone and explore other cultures. The last thing I want to see is other students feel unwelcome at this university because of lack of representation, like Mr. George Starke had to leave UF. All students deserve an equal opportunity to an education, and I am thankful for the fight of Mr. Virgil Hawkins and Mr. George Starke. It is people like them that make me proud to be a Florida Gator. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Dr. Deidre Houchin, postdoctoral associate for the Center for the Study of Race and Race Relations. And I'm excited to share information with you on our 3-site exhibition on view at Smathers Library, in the Legal Information Center here at the Law School, and at the Aquin Jones Museum and Cultural Center in the community of Gainesville. The exhibition is only possible due to the hard work of a team of wonderful individuals. Florence Turcott, Lourdes Santa Maria Wheeler, Desmond Walker, Delreese Martin, Joe Kalita, and Desmond Walker, the advisor for the Aquin Jones Museum and Cultural Center. I thank you all for your dedication and hard work on the project. For the remainder of my presentation, I'll be sharing the story of the exhibition with you and giving you a sneak peek into all the 3 sites. We hope you visit all 3. The exhibition tells an intertwined story of how Black educators paved the way for social justice in their schools and through their organizing across the state during Jim Crow. With the assistance of the NAACP and with implications here at the University of Florida. This is the exhibit hall at Smathers Library. And like any good story, our story begins with a secret. In 1937, 5 black educators met under the cover of night at Howard Academy in Ocala, Florida. They were Noah Griffin, Edward Davis, John Gilbert, Gilbert Porter, all of whom were black principals across the state of Florida, and Harry T. Moore, who at that time was an educator working in Mims, Florida. There they planned what they called a program of equalization, a series of lawsuits to equalize black and white teachers' salaries and advance equity for children of color and white children across the state. With the assistance of lawyer Samuel McGill, one of the first African-American attorneys in Florida, they contacted Walter White and ultimately Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and convinced Mr. Marshall that Florida was ready and should be the second state that the NAACP should use to push forth their agenda for equalizing teacher salaries in hopes of toppling the Jim Crow system. Through that effort, the Florida State Teachers Association and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund ultimately brought 8 cases across the state of Florida. Not all of them were successful, but with each case, the NAACP and this group hoped to set a precedent that would bring a new day to pass. The exhibition highlights those court cases to bring home the message that change is not always a linear journey. It has fits and starts. Sometimes it takes decades, even centuries. Edward Davis, who began his public advocacy work there in 1937, would later go on to describe the Virgil Hawkins case as his last battle for justice. These artifacts, highlighted in the exhibition, shows also that same long road of perseverance. It is a list of every African American applicant who applied to the university between 1945 and 1954. And there is a third page. There are over 40 applicants. We celebrate the perseverance of those brave men and women who continued to apply against all odds. The exhibition at Smathers continues highlighting the story of Virgil Hawkins, but with some popular media references for children and college students. To the right is a DC comic book called Static Shock. In the comic, the main character, Static Shock, is a superhero who is named after Virgil Ovid Hawkins, our own hero here at UF. In the exhibition, we showcase all the firsts at the University of Florida, including Mr. Starke and every other African American first admitted to each college across the campus. The second site of the exhibition is here at the law school in the Legal Information Center. There is a permanent exhibit dedicated to the legacy of Virgil Hawkins. We included this site in the exhibition and as a digital project, updated the timeline displayed within it. In the photo here are members of the Virgil Hawkins family who toured the clinic that bears his name and the exhibit last week. The digital timeline includes information leading up to the entrance of Mr. George Starke and continues to the present, highlighting crucial moments of struggle and victory and sometimes collective mourning and pain, as with the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012. But that's not all. There's a third and final site of the exhibition, the Aquin Jones and Cultural Center, Museum and Cultural Center in the community of Gainesville, Florida. This site takes us into the world of black segregated schools during Jim Crow, where we find teachers who love with dedication, prepared students for citizenship and service with rigor, and championed justice and democracy. Lincoln High School was the second institution in a 100-year trajectory of African American education here in Gainesville. It was a beloved institution that was closed in 1970 as schools in Gainesville and across the South finally desegregated. Lincoln was largely responsible for building and preserving Gainesville's African American community as its hub and center. In fact, Mr. Andrew Mickle, father of Judge Mickle, served as an educator and department chair at Lincoln High School for decades. This is the kind of connection between community and university we hope our exhibition highlights. The exhibition begins with a wall-sized panel of a black classroom at Lincoln High School and continues with 4 rooms of artifacts and information showcasing the professionalism and excellence of black educators who pursued an education system that would adequately prepare students to enter the world as accomplished, prepared citizens and responsible adults. In the midst of a dangerous and precarious world, black educators systematically increased their professional capacity and their school's ability to graduate students into the world who would change the world. The exhibit at the Aquin Jones Museum and Cultural Center culminates with a celebration of commencement, leaving visitors with the same feel of jubilation that these first 8 graduates at Lincoln High School felt upon their achievement. It is our hope and belief that art, public scholarship, and the sharing of stories of those known and unknown heroes who fought for justice in the past has the potential to alter and inform our present. We hope that you will visit the exhibition, and I'm honored to share it with you today. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we want you to know that our program will likely extend about 15 minutes longer than we hoped. We expect that you'll be patient and ask you to just remain in your seats if you wouldn't mind. Thank you very much.
Okay. Come on. Yes, they are. Okay. Okay, we are mic'd. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Antonio Farias, and I have the honor of serving as the moderator to what I hope will be a dynamic sort of conversation about past and present. I have the honor of serving as the Chief Diversity Officer, the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer for the University of Florida. And I want to thank Mr. Starke for infusing a level of complexity and humanity into a history that is sometimes flattened out for us. Thank you, sir. Why we are gathered here today matters, and it matters because leadership sort of cares about this. So I want to thank Dean Rosenbury for her courageous leadership in this process, and also to Dr. Catherine Russell Brown for her courageous leadership of the center and stewardship of the center for the last 15 years. And of course, the work you just saw, I would highly encourage you to go see Dr. Houchin's exhibit. It is flooring, to say the least, to understand that our history, we've all seen Hidden Figures. There's enough hidden figures in her primary research to fill volumes and volumes and volumes. And what we have to understand is that all of that history is there for us, and it will vanish with us unless we sort of excavate it. We have been conditioned to think about the narrative of race in this country as something that starts with tragedy and ends with a happy ending. And as today's events tell us, nothing could be further from the truth. And so today, what I'd like to sort of frame for us is a conversation around, actually this is a book that my dear mentor, Professor Ted Shaw, sort of just recommended, and I managed to pick up the first chapter last night, which is a book by David Blight called Race and Reunion, where he talks about reconciliation, reconstruction, and emancipation. And I would argue that the conversations that we're having and we continue to have or refuse to have around race in this country are all circle around this framework. We can't speak about desegregation at UF without understanding the impact of things like the Johns Committee that was led from 1956 to 1965 in a very McCarthyistic sort of era that initially was a targeted attempt against the NAACP, and when they proved to be a formidable foe, moved to a more sort of malleable target, which was the LGBT community in the state of Florida, and in particular in the University of Florida. The reason I bring that up is because we are reminded, I think, by Kimberly Crenshaw's understanding of intersectionality and how it impacts on the individual, and we need to think about this to what our young students are telling us, that we need to think about how intersectionality also works at the group level, and how we need to sort of be cognizant of how discrimination against one is really discrimination against all. As it has been said, the numbers have fallen precipitously. I came from California, where Prop 209 plummeted the numbers of African Americans and all historically underrepresented minorities. Here at Florida, just like Michigan, we're under state statute where the numbers have changed from 1999, when we were at 18% across the entire Florida system of African Americans, which modeled and mirrored the 18% of the African American population in Florida, to current state where the current population, African American population in the state of Florida is roughly 21%, and yet the representation across the state system is at 12%. And within the University of Florida itself, it's at 6%. And lest you think that others are doing better, if you look at the top 10, top 20 schools in the country, we are ranked, unfortunately, number 2. So, and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is actually ranked number 1. And that's because they have 7% African Americans. So this is a problem that is pernicious across the nation. I'd like to give a really brief, annotated sort of bio on each of our speakers. Both of them have encyclopedic memories and understandings of these concepts. Dr. Carl Van Ness is the Mr. Carl Van Ness is the curator of manuscripts and archives in the department at the University of Florida Smathers Library. He is also the university historian, which means he knows all things, right, where they are hidden, and will expose them in part for us. Theodore Shaw is the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina School of Law at Chapel Hill. Teaches procedural and advanced constitutional law, the 14th Amendment, and before joining the faculty at UNC Law School, he served in the Columbia Law Faculty. His distinguishing trait, in my opinion, and his heroic trait, is that he follows in the largest footsteps of Thurgood Marshall, serving as the 5th director of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund for over 26 years. So I welcome you both to the panel, and what we're going to do, rather than have a back and forth because we are pressed for time and there are other speakers to come forward, is we're going to have about 7 minutes each, and we're going to start with Carl, who's going to contextualize UF and the Gainesville sort of community and really talk about it at a system level, and think us through what we're discussing when it comes to these issues of race at UF. So Carl?
Thank you. And thank you to the College of Law for inviting me here today. I usually just talk about history, but today I got to meet history, and it's a tremendous privilege to be here on this occasion. As a starting point for my remarks, I brought a photograph from the University Archives, and this depicts an event that occurs on June 6, 1916. And what you're seeing is the installation of the University of Florida chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And the woman is from the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and she's passing the colors to the commander of the Center of Confederate Veterans. So what are these organizations? Both still exist, but the UDC still does what it did basically back in 1916, but it no longer has the power and influence that it had back in those days. Its mission is to memorialize the hundreds of thousands of men who fought for the Confederacy and to perpetuate and sustain the myth that they fought for a just and noble cause. In other words, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was about the war of northern aggression, and these men were just defending their homeland. And by the way, according to the UDC, the slaves were all happy and content. The UDC is remembered chiefly because they erected monuments throughout the South and even outside the South to commemorate Confederate war dead, including the recently deceased monument to the deceased that was in downtown Gainesville, which luckily has been taken down. Unfortunately, most of the other 700 are still there, and hopefully they will be taken down over the years as well. So how powerful was the UDC? In 1911, 5 years before this photograph was taken, the UDC launched a campaign to fire the University of Florida's history professor, Enoch Banks. Enoch Banks had written an article arguing that the South was equally to blame for the Civil War. Equally. Not solely to blame as it was actually the historical case, but just equally to blame. Well, the UDC didn't like that. Banks had besmirched the names of all these men who had died for this noble cause, and they demanded he be fired. He was forced to resign. He went home and died shortly afterwards. He was a very young man, and it's speculated that he probably committed suicide when he returned home. The commander of the Sons is actually Archie Robertson, who was a student here in 1916. Later on, came back to the University of Florida as an English professor and was head of the English department for many years. The flag still exists, but we don't have it because it was accidentally sent to the Historical Museum of Tallahassee in the 1970s and was never returned. So that presents a dilemma for the curator of the artifact collection, which happens to be me. And should I ask it to be returned? I would cherish your opinions. I'm going to jump 42 years to 1958, the year that George Starke changed the University of Florida. In 1958, the House Un-American Activities Committee launched an investigation into communist subversion in the civil rights movement. And it was in a blatant attempt to undermine the civil rights movement. Taking its cue from HUAC, the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, chaired by Senate President Charlie Johns, launched its own version of that investigation in Florida. And basically, they just copied the same pattern. And as Antonio said, they didn't have a lot of luck there. They found lots of civil rights activists, but didn't find a lot of communist subversives to link them to. So they went on to investigate gays and lesbians in public education. Now, to put this in a historical context, to be a sexually active gay person in 1958 is to be a criminal, because every state in the nation has an anti-sodomy law. Furthermore, the American Psychological Association considers homosexuality to be a mental disorder. And this is attested to in the university archives. We actually have records from the Student Health Center, which they kept all the statistics for every ailment that was treated, and included in that was a category for sexual deviancy. Why were gays and lesbians considered subversive? Well, the public perception back in those days was that gays and lesbians recruited children and young adults into their homosexual lifestyle and made them gay. The Johns Committee took its investigation into the University of Florida in 1959 with the full support and cooperation of the university administration. 10 faculty and an undetermined number of staff members were just simply dismissed. There were no legal proceedings. They had no legal counsel. And also a number of gay students were also investigated, and we don't know how many as well. In the decade after 1958, integration proceeded at the University of Florida at a glacial pace. I call these years a kind of a lost decade for racial improvement. The university took a passive approach to to integration. You thanked President Rice for his willingness not to do anything, to prevent anything from happening. But on the other hand, he also did nothing to recruit faculty or students or retain them as well. And the black students who came to the University of Florida at that time came to a culture dominated by people like students like Archie Robertson. To give you one example, in those days it was a tradition to play Dixie right before the kickoff for football games. And at the same time that the band was playing Dixie, the student card section, I'll try to explain what a student card section is. This is before jumbotrons, and the students would create images flipping cards. So while the band was playing Dixie, the student card section would make a gigantic Confederate flag. And that's just one example of kind of the student culture that exists in the 1960s. By way of contrast, in 1962, the same year that the undergraduate program was integrated, we had the first wave of Cuban exile students here. And these Cuban exile students are brought in, they're welcomed, they're nurtured, and they do everything they can to make them, so that they'll achieve that success as students. And I'm not saying this was wrong. This was the absolute right thing to do, but this would also have been the right thing to do for native Floridians, the sons and daughters of native Floridians whose descendants been in the state for hundreds of years and received horrible oppression. By the end of the 1960s, there were still less than 200 African American students at the University of Florida. Well, I'm just going to jump ahead here. In 1967, Stephen C. O'Connell became the university president, and we all know he came with a lot of baggage. He had been on the Supreme Court, Florida Supreme Court, when Virgil Hawkins and others were making their case, and he wrote many of the legal opinions supporting segregation. He comes to the University of Florida. He does make some changes. He implements a number of procedures, a number of reforms and initiatives that his predecessor failed to make, but it was the proverbial too little and way too late. He failed to grasp the frustration that the students were feeling at the time, and was surprised when 60 African American students staged a sit-down strike on April 15th, 1971, a Thursday, hereafter known as Black Thursday. The students were arrested. There were subsequent demonstrations. There were more arrests. The students asked for clemency. That was refused. And when that happened, about half of the African American students enrolled at the University of Florida simply up and left. They quit. Black Thursday ended up being a black eye for the University of Florida, but it was also a watershed event. After Black Thursday, changes occur at the University of Florida at a much more rapid pace. The IBC was created, the Institute of Black Culture was created the following year. We have our first black student body president, elected in 1972, black homecoming queen, no more Dixie at the football games, and just a much more robust affirmative action program. So, in my closing, why the sudden change after 1971? Well, a lot of it was a reaction to Black Thursday and those demands that the students made. But there were also just dramatic shifts that were going on in Florida at that time. After World War II, Florida, millions of people moved into Florida after World War II. They come from the New York City, Chicago, Boston, elsewhere. And they raise families, and their children begin to come to the University of Florida in the 1960s and 1970s. And then by the mid-1970s, the descendants of men who had fought for the Confederacy, like R.G. Robertson, they're a minority. It's no longer, white Southerners are no longer dominate the culture of the University of Florida. To cite just one example of the changes that occurred during this time, prior to World War II, there were maybe 150 to 200 Jewish students enrolled at the university. Today we have 6,000 on average enrolled at the University of Florida. That's just a tremendous demographic change. In closing, I said earlier that the 1960s were a wasted decade. Sadly, I feel that we've had some recent years that were also wasted years. That we've lost some of the progress that we made in the 1970s. And I personally would like to see the spirit of April 15th, 1971 rekindled, and I'd like to see additional progress being made at the University of Florida.
Thank you, Carl. And we'll transition. And Carl, in his encyclopedic memory, will be here after the panel. We won't have Ted Shaw here for long. He does need to catch a flight, but I would encourage you to also sort of pick his brain. So, Ted, can you sort of
Slim pickings.
Hardly. Can you contextualize the Florida system within the larger sort of project of the LDF?
I can. I'm so conscious of the fact that I am not a Florida person, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you today, just to be appropriate. I want to thank you, Dean, for the opportunity to be at your law school, and I also am grateful to the others who have been participating in the program, but particularly I want to, of course, honor Mr. Starke for what you've done and who you are. So it's an honor to be in your presence. I'm here because of my now dear friend of some years, Antonio, and he tells me that I have 7 minutes. I can't clear my throat in 7 minutes, but I will do my best to be brief, and I have to be because I have a flight to catch, so my fate is in my own hands. Prior to Brown versus Board of Education, and you've heard some of this already, there was an effort that now has been called the Road to Brown. And that effort, in terms of law, had two parts. One was an attack on public school segregation, not frontally, but on the fact that separate but equal could never be equal, and the attack was on unequal teacher salaries. You could see very easily there were black teachers and administrators who feared desegregation correctly because they feared for their jobs. But they could all get on board in terms of teacher salaries, and the fact that black teachers were paid less was a glaring example of how separate but equal is never equal. The other part of all of this was higher education desegregation, because the attack on higher ed segregation didn't raise some of the sensitivities with respect to young children that elementary and secondary school desegregation would raise, but also, that's not to say it wasn't controversial, but also it was a real Achilles heel for separate but equal, because universities and states could never make segregation equal. They couldn't duplicate all of the graduate schools and programs that existed in higher education. And enforcing those questions, one, exposed the hypocrisy and the bankruptcy of segregation. And so the Road to Brown was made up of cases that included colleges and universities throughout the South. Murray in Maryland, and Gaines in Missouri. The cases that many of you in law school have heard of and studied in brief: McLaurin in Oklahoma, Sweat in Texas. That's the Road to Brown versus Board of Education. And then, of course, finally, the 5 Brown cases involving elementary and secondary school education. But the Legal Defense Fund, and by the way, I'm flattered by, but I have to correct that. I was not head of the Legal Defense Fund for 26 years, though I did work there for 26 years and eventually was head of it. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I don't want to go back because I know people who know people at the Legal Defense Fund, and I don't want to get called out. But in the early 60s, the desegregation effort was slow and painful, but in 1964, Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act, and Title VI of that act forbade discrimination in federally funded programs, and that was used both with respect to elementary and secondary education, but also higher education. And a few years later, there was a suit filed, I think in 1969, by the Legal Defense Fund that was a very complex piece of litigation and long-lasting. And it was called Adams versus whoever the current, at the time, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare was. So early years, for a while, it was Califano and other HEW secretaries. And the idea was to force, using Title VI as leverage, the desegregation of higher education. All of this was very controversial because historically black colleges and universities, again, rightfully feared that desegregation would lead to their eventual demise. And they also were concerned about their faculty, their administrators, et cetera. But this litigation recognized the fact that those schools were never funded equally. I don't want to be presumptuous, but it wouldn't be. I won't even have to, I just ask you to think about Florida, the HBCUs, which have been so vitally important and crucial to African Americans. But I want you to think about those institutions and their facilities, their funding, and compare them to the flagship institution, the University of Florida, and other historically white institutions. You can do the same thing going to any southern state. Go to Louisiana, look at LSU, and then look at Southern University. Look at Louisiana Tech and Grambling, and I can go on and on. So a lot of pride in what those institutions did for and with African American students at a time when they couldn't access education in these historically white institutions, but also an understanding that they've never been treated the same way the historically white institutions were. And so part of the leverage that the Legal Defense Fund sought to bear was to make these state systems put new programs at historically black institutions to make them stronger, and also to further desegregation or the possibility of desegregation. That was a long struggle. The states resisted. I could tell you, if I had the time, which I don't, in great detail, how some of that played out and how viciously some of those battles were fought. But suffice it to say that it was a long, long struggle that never really ended. I dare say that the historically black institutions, while they were suspicious and even hostile to these efforts, they were represented by the state, not by, for example, the Legal Defense Fund. And so that created difficulties in terms of the Legal Defense Fund and working with them directly to try to bring more resources to those institutions. That's another thing that requires much more exposition than time allows. There were efforts to strengthen historically black institutions that brought some success in terms of new programs, in terms of funds, but it was a mixed story. And at the end of the day, the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C., before which these cases, or the Adams cases was pending, they eventually, or it eventually, I should say, found that the plaintiffs, even though they had been litigating the case for almost 20 years, didn't have standing any longer, and never had standing, and dismissed the case. And so that was that. Florida was one of the institutions that was covered under Adams, and there were Adams principles, and I'll try to wrap this up, Antonio, that were developed. And the principles included matters like the historically black institutions should get the new programs and the new science and technology, STEM programs, for example. And also, they should not be required to desegregate in terms of reaching goals and numbers that some tried to force upon the HBCUs before the historically white institutions desegregated. Because if anything other than that happened, there would be a net loss of opportunities for African Americans at the historically black institutions. Those and other programs in terms of protecting, or principles rather, in terms of protecting black faculty and administrators, was very complex and very controversial. And at the end of the day, much like what happened in elementary and secondary school desegregation, because elementary and secondary schools were desegregated, many of them, for some time in the 1970s after Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education and the controversial remedy of busing, as it was called. But in the 1980s, much of that went down the drain. The courts withdrew, just as they did in higher education, and we see more segregation in elementary and secondary public school education now than we've seen in decades, and some people point out that these schools are as segregated as they were immediately after Brown. And so I say all the time that we honor Brown as one of the most important constitutional cases decided, but we honor it more in principle than in fact. Brown is hallowed, but it's hollow now. And the same thing is true similarly in higher education in many of the southern states. I think we have to continue to support the HBCUs and to argue for more resources for those institutions. Some of those institutions now enroll substantial numbers of white students, but some of these institutions, depending on where we're talking about, have suffered greatly, and a few have even had their doors closed as a consequence. At the same time that we have to work to open up opportunities and continue to have these opportunities open up for African American and Latino students and students of color at the institutions that were historically white. Really the last thing, follow and watch what's going on in higher ed, the long struggles that have that started with Bakke, talk about 40 years ago, right on up to the present, that are playing out at Harvard University, and also a lot of people aren't aware of this, but the University of North Carolina undergraduate has been sued. So those two cases are pending. I've been involved and engaged with fights in those issues, involved in those issues in very significant ways for the last 40 years almost. And I'll just say that with this Supreme Court, I think that the battles we've been fighting may possibly be brought to a close, and the consequences will not be good. But my hope is that the institutions now have become so committed to doing the right thing that one way or another, no matter what this Supreme Court may say, that they'll find a way. I hope that's right. I hope that they've taken this and internalized it and will remain committed to it. So I'll stop there, and thank you. I've gone beyond my 7 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We will transition out, and again, unlike a story of hope, it's a story that is developing. So continue the work that you're doing as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Farley, and I serve as Senior Director of Development and Alumni Affairs here at Levin College of Law. I would like to introduce to you two of our special guests today. First is Lori Gleim. Lori is a 1995 graduate of the College of Law and the CEO of Gleim Publications here in Gainesville. Beside her is Mrs. Jacqueline Moorhead, wife of former Professor Michael Jonathan Moorhead. Thank you both for being here today. As we honor the story of these trailblazers today, we would like to highlight the role of Professor Michael Moorhead in that important conversation. Professor Moorhead taught at UF Law from 1978 until 1994 and was its first tenured African-American full professor. He taught countless law students in the disciplines of property law, administrative law, labor law, and government regulation of business. He served as chairman of the Graduate and Professional Financial Aid Council for Education Testing Service and on the Board of Trustees of the Law School Admission Council. During his 24 years of teaching law, he also published numerous articles on civil rights, affirmative action, and legal education issues. On the occasion of today's celebration, we would like to remind our community of friends and supporters of the Professor Michael Jonathan Moorhead Florida Opportunity Scholars in Law Scholarship Fund. This scholarship was formed by Lori and several others to honor Professor Moorhead's outstanding legacy to the law school and its students. Professor Moorhead strived throughout his career to help make a quality legal education available to high-achieving students regardless of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. In following through on this desire to foster diversity and excellence in education, the funds from this endowment will be used to provide annual scholarships to outstanding first-generation native Floridian students. We invite all of you to explore the opportunity of supporting our amazing and diverse student body through a donation to the scholarship fund that bears Professor Moorhead's name and recognizes his impact on UF Law. My team and I would be happy to speak with you here today or send you more information on how you can help a new generation of young scholars reach their goals through a legal education at UF's Levin College of Law.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Brathwaite. I'm a third-year student here at Levin College of Law. I plan to practice corporate litigation. I came to the U.S. from Venezuela as a child. I'm black and Latino, and I'll be the first in my family with a professional degree. Because of the work of those who were first, such as Mr. Hawkins and Mr. Starke, when my time came to apply to college and attend, I never had to worry about whether the color of my skin would prevent me from being admitted or whether it will get me killed. For that, I am deeply appreciative. With that gratitude comes a duty. The duty is to continue their work. Today, some of us have to work harder to prove our merit that others are presumed to have. So there's work to be done. And much of this work is internal, staying true to yourself and what you believe is right, but then remaining there. Because it's easy to start off caring and passionate, but we still need to care about others when we experience hard times. Mr. Hawkins and Mr. Starke stayed the course and stayed true to their principles of doing good. I plan to continue this legacy in my career. So it doesn't matter where the act of practice in law takes me. The real mission is to care for those around me and incrementally improve my community. And my community includes all of us. So thank you to the Virgil Hawkins family, to you, Mr. George Starke, and to all of those who were first that came before us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Miller. I'm a first-year law student and a future criminal law attorney. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Hawkins' family last week when they visited the law school. When I met them, I expressed my gratitude with tears for Mr. Hawkins' fight. I'm honored to now get the opportunity to also express my gratitude to Mr. Starke and his family, which is also how I ended up here today. So thank you to Professor Russell Brown and Dr. Houchin for inviting me here tonight. No words could ever properly express my sentiments, but today I will try. If someone said to you, I have an opportunity for you, you can change lives and create a better world, you'd go down in history. It sounded like a good opportunity at first, until you read the fine print. The fine print that tell you, you'll be fighting a fight that lasts decades. You'll be constantly ridiculed and attacked. You'll be physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted daily. Your family safety could not be guaranteed. Oh, and by the way, you'll be fighting the United States government and majority of its citizens. At that point, you might rethink the opportunity. But Mr. Hawkins, Mr. Starke, and Mr. Allen, they just did it. They knew what they were getting themselves into. They knew it'd be a long fight. They knew they'd have strangers actively working towards their demise. But they were resilient for the black students who would come after them. They fought the good fight so that I wouldn't have to. The Florida Supreme Court required Mr. Hawkins to withdraw his application so that I could submit mine. Even though he was unable to realize his own dream of graduating from this law school, he made it possible for me and thousands of other students to realize their dreams of attending the University of Florida Levin College of Law. Mr. Hawkins didn't know me, yet he fought for me. In return, it is important for me and my black classmates to realize that the fight is by no means finished. Mr. Hawkins laid the foundation. Mr. Starke and Mr. Allen ensured that the foundation was sturdy. But we still have a long ways to go. I will use these legacies to inspire me and remind me why I fight for my people. I realized I needed to fight the first day I walked inside of a prison. This was a part of my undergraduate criminal justice studies. I was facilitating a new weekly rehabilitation workshop. I had noticed that everyone in the prison looked just like me. It was at that point I discovered my purpose. I want to see more representation of my people in office, not behind bars. I want to shake up the criminal justice system. And that means that I know that I'll be faced with adversary along the way. But I'll think about Mr. Virgil Hawkins, Mr. George Starke, and Mr. W. George Allen, and I'll fight, even when I'm physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted. I may or may not see a drastic change during my lifetime, but if I can inspire others the way that these men have inspired me, well then we can change the world as we see it. I want to extend the most sincere gratitude to the families of these men. You descend from trailblazers who read the fine print and still chose to fight for me. Thank you all so much for your time.
We thank all of you for coming, for staying over. History doesn't have a time frame, so thank you, thank you, thank you, and we hope you will join us for the reception just outdoors. And we hope we've given you some nuggets, some kernels to think about, to consider, to share, and to learn from. Thank you all for coming today.